a pine marten pouncing on a shrew, a striped dolphin chasing a school of cod. As soon as the thought registers, the smell has gone. A hound bays in the distance. It is downwind from me and has recognized my scent. I bay back, recognizes kin. Although I run with the grace of a pond skater, there comes a point when I have to stop. I brace my hands against my knees, breath coming in gulps. In that moment, I am all human, only human. There is no sorrow in the change. The wilderness hovers on the edge of my consciousness, ever present and comforting. I wipe a sheen of sweat from my forehead, a mixture of beads of dew and salt from the sea. Everything is connected. I smile at the thought as I begin the long walk back to my car. So yeah, that's my book.
Thank you, Laura.
That's right. So to start off, we wanted to talk about the self-editing process. So basically what happens before your book is ready to be sent out, whether you are looking to self-publish or whether you're going to query agents or whether to direct to a small publisher, which is what happened with me and Louise, although our story is slightly more convoluted than that. And I just want to preface everything I say by saying that if you ever come across someone that says, this is how you write a book, these are the rules that you must follow, they are by default wrong. That's not how it works. There are some rules that are worth following, but for the most part, it's a process that you have to learn how to make it your own. So I'm going to talk about how I draft my novels, but it's taken me several books and a lot of trial and error to get where I am with my process. And I'm still learning and my process is still changing because I grow more as a writer with every book that I write. So like with any other, like finding your voice, like finding what genre works for you, don't be afraid to experiment. And don't assume that what you do with your first novel is going to be how it will always be, because it will change and it will evolve as you evolve as a writer. So that's my caveat, basically. But when I write my first drafts, I tend not to edit as I go along. I know some people do. I prefer not to, and I will basically start every writing session by glancing at what I did the previous time. Sometimes I remember, sometimes I don't, and I will just carry on from there. And the only time I would self-edit during the first draft is if I've had to put down a manuscript halfway through because I've been working on something else and I genuinely can't remember what I've written. And it happened to me with the 5th book in my series. I set it down for about 8 months, and when I came back to it, I was like, so there was a murder and stuff, and I just couldn't remember the details of the crime, so I had to go back and I read the whole thing from the beginning, and I did do a light edit on the first half of the book, not least because the character names changed. Like I referred to the same people with 2 different names, and there were some alarming mistakes, which just goes to show that even after 8 novels, your first drafts are far from perfect, and that's completely okay. But if you feel like you benefit from editing as you go along, you want to just give your previous sessions writing a once-over before you get started, that's completely fine. But that's not something I do. When I get to the end of my first draft, this is the point where one of these big rules with a capital R comes into play, because it's really important that you let your manuscript to rest. And it sounds really weird because often when you get to the end, you're like, yes, I finished this book. It's awesome. I can't wait to do something with it. And actually, that's the point where you kind of pat yourself on the back and you buy a stack of books and you go and sit on your sofa and eat a ton of chocolate and read other books and do other things. You can start writing another book or another project, but you need to let that manuscript rest, because during that resting period, you take a step back from the story and you forget what you've written. Not obviously all of it, unless you're me and just can't remember anything about your writing. But it gives you that objectivity that you're going to need for editing. And it's something that an awful lot of people struggle, I included. It's really hard to be objective about your own writing, especially when you go back to it and go, oh, this is quite good, I'm awesome. And then you start kind of going, well, I don't need to edit this because it's awesome, but actually you really, really do. I prefer to rest my manuscripts for at least 6 weeks. It depends on whether I'm on a tight deadline, but generally I would set them aside for 6 weeks, 2 months, maybe. If I've got time, the longer I can leave it, the better it is. And then when I come back to it, I tend to edit. I start off on paper. But even during that resting period, although I'm sort of actively trying to forget what I've written, I do think about the story, and I do write editing notes for myself. And that's something that I start off while I'm doing the first draft, but particularly during the resting period, I write myself questions and observations as I kind of ponder the story, and I think about because I write series, I have to think about the wider implications of it. So there are things like, am I making sure that this character is reacting consistently to a particular issue throughout the book? And I might write and say, actually, this bit is underdeveloped in the first draft and I have to expand on it because I've not explained it well. And it's all sorts of that kind of things. And when I start reading my manuscript after the resting period, during the first read through, I make a lot more of these editing notes. And I tend to kind of flag up issues in the manuscript where something is unclear, or I've missed out something, or someone's reactions just doesn't feel right. And the first read through, as I said, I tend to do it on paper, so I print my manuscript out. I'm killing trees, I'm sorry about that, but it just helps me see. And I love having a red pen. Literally, I have a ton of red pens, and I will make my corrections, on a red pen. And I like it. And I tend to first read through is looking at the big picture. So I'm looking at the story and plot holes, and does it all make sense, and does it kind of flow through, and have I forgotten anything, like any detail of the crime? Is everything tied together? If I spot spelling mistakes, I do kind of flag them up, but mainly I'm concerned with the story. I will then tend to, I'll read it again, basically straight away. As soon as I get to the end, I'll read it again. I get then a green pen, because, color pens are awesome. And then I will do a line edit. So I'm looking at the dialogue and repetition with words. I tend to overuse the word get. I've been shouted at about it. So I'm really conscious about taking those out at that stage. And there are other words that I'm inordinately fond of that I have to be really careful about. And I'll kind of, on the first round of edits, when I'm looking at the story, I tend to write questions in the margins of my manuscript. And then on the second round, because I've just read the story and all the details are fresh in my mind, I then tend to answer my questions, and I'm still writing in the margins. And occasionally I have arguments between different rounds of edits where I insult myself. That's really productive. And then once I've read it through twice, I might, depending on the book, if I think the first draft is not quite right and I'm not quite happy with it, or if I have tons of times, I might read it for the third time while still on paper, and then I might use a blue pen, just because it makes it clear what I'm thinking about in different rounds of edits and what kind of thoughts I have about the manuscript. Then I will put through all those edits on a electronic version, and then at that point it would go to my beta reader / beta readers, depending on the book. they will give me their feedback. I'll go through it again. I'll put through any feedback that they've said. I will read my manuscript again, not necessarily on paper, but I might put it on my tablet, change the font and put it on my tablet where I can annotate a PDF copy, which is really handy. And then I'll put it through Grammarly for spell checking. And then I'll go through Word spell checking as well, because they tend to pick up different things, which is really handy. But you have to be really careful with things like Grammarly, because it has a very specific style for commas that is not the style that Louise uses. So I can't, if Grammarly says, no, take that comma away, I'm like, no, I won't. Go away. I'll keep my commas. So it's really handy to use all these different tools, but just be mindful of the fact that not all of them will necessarily be really helpful for you. And then at that point, I will cross my fingers and send the manuscript to Louise and send her lots of chocolate in the hopes that she'll like my book.
Thank you. So shall I take over now?
Yeah.
Okay. So Laura, it's 20 past 4, so I'm conscious of the time's racing away with us already. So I'm going to skip out my introduction because Carly introduced me at the start. I'm an editor, writer, run my own indie press. And my freelance work, I've edited over 100 projects by now, mostly novels or novellas, also screenplays, narrative nonfiction, memoir, and I've worked on short stories and flash fictions as well. I was going to do this big spiel about, well, what does an editor do? But I think what I'll do is I'll focus on what Laura's been talking about, because basically the process that Laura puts herself through, we then go through again, don't we? But it's a lot more collaborative because you're working with somebody else. So really, my job, I've come to realise that my job as an editor, I really mediate between, it's mediation between the writer and the reader. And as an editor, I'm slightly more on the reader's side than the writer. That sounds a bit odd, but I'm the first beta reader's side. I'm the first reader of one of Laura's novels or any of my author's novels. And probably one of the most attentive readers you'll have. So it's just another pair of eyes, and I also get to know the manuscript almost as well as the writer does. Not quite as well, but second in command, I suppose you could say. I get a bit bossy, don't I, Laura? But someone's got to. I'll keep your writers under control. So yeah, mediation is really important. When it came to me a while ago when I was working on something else, I'm just mediating here. But I absolutely love doing it, and polishing a manuscript is such a rewarding process to go through. So I was going to talk all sorts of things, but I think I'm going to stick to what Laura and I do, and then maybe come back to some of the other stuff later. So Laura sends me her manuscript. The first thing I do is read it all the way through in one go. And then we'll start on our edit. Now, we normally do one big edit in one. It depends on how well written it is when it reaches me. Some writers need a bit more input. So the first edit is the structural edit, which is where we look at bigger issues such as plot, structure, characterization. Sometimes I'll ask authors to take a chapter out if a chapter's not working, because sometimes chapters aren't pulling their weight. So it's all the kind of the bigger stuff, the bigger picture. Once we're both satisfied with that, that goes backwards and forwards a couple of times, and we leave lots of comments in track changes and have little arguments almost here and there, but it's always friendly. And then we do a line edit. Now the line edit gets a lot more microscopic. It's literally looking at every single sentence, making sure that every single sentence is doing what the writer wanted it to do. I read somewhere that an editor helps the writer to write the novel they think they've written. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, because as a writer, I'm a writer too, so I understand that we become really blind, can become very blind to what we've written. And the editor is kind of one step removed and can spot things a little easier. So I've got some samples for you actually. Laura's very kindly agreed to let me type in the chat bar some sentences from her recent book that we've just been working on. I'm going to plug it. It's called The Doves in the Dining Room, and it's a novella. It's out in November. And I'm going to type in the first of the sentences that I wanted to show you, to give you an example of what a line edit does. So Laura had this sentence. Can everybody see it? I hope you can. I'll read it too. I've typed it. So the soup is bright orange in colour. That was the sentence. And I corrected that. I said, we don't need in colour. We just need the soup is bright orange, because orange is a colour. And you don't need to say in colour. So that's just there it is. That's just one of the samples. Another one we had, and I see this construction quite a lot. But
can you just change your the panelists to panelists and attendees, and then we can see what you're writing in the chat box? And is that okay? Just because I think the attendees won't be able to see it, if that's okay. And it's just a little blue box, and then you panelists and you click it. It's a
okay. Is that better?
The blue box where it says to panelists and attendees, you just click the box and it should say, you should make it panelists and attendees, so that just so everyone can see it. I can also pop the question into the, or sorry.
I'll type it in. I'll type it in.
Oh, thank you. Oh.
Here we go. Got it.
Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the second one. I'm just typing in the second one. I can't see that box you're talking about. As my teeth begin to chat.
It's the actual panelist. It's the word panelist in blue. You press that and a drop down menu comes up, and then you press panelists and attendees. So in your actual little thing, you know, where it says panelists, if you press that, and then it should drop down another menu.
Oh, it doesn't.
It's got the chat line. It should say to, and then it's got a drop down box. Mine said everyone, and it's got panelists and attendees ticked.
Oh.
We can cut and paste.
Yeah, we can also just share it with everyone if you want to type it in.
I don't have that on here at all. That's really
Shall
strange.
I type it in?
Okay, so my next sentence that I corrected was, but as my teeth begin to chatter. And that's quite a common construction. Lots of writers have begin to. They really like to use the word begin to. Well, not, most of the time, the character's just doing it. So I changed that to, but as my teeth chatter. Because it's just it's a cleaner sentence, a shorter sentence, and that's the meaning. You don't need begin to. Only use begin to when you really do need begin to. Try and avoid that. And I have one more, which was, I'll just take this one and I'll read it. These are just examples of the sort of thing we do together when we're doing the line editing. Oh no, it's going to be typos. Ignore the typos. Okay, so the next one was a memory half buried in my mind rises to the surface. And I said, I just struck out in my mind. We don't need in my mind, we just need the memory, because memories can't really be anywhere else. So that's the kind of thing we do when we're line editing. And it can take a long time. And then once I've done my initial line edit, it will go back to Laura, and Laura will go through it as well. And if there's anything in there she doesn't agree with, she'll put a note in the track changes, and then we go backwards and forwards several times, don't we? Until we're both happy.
Yeah, we had an argument. I had written that the character was hungover. Her mouth tasted of mothballs and brandy, and he said, "What is she? Not actually mothballs." And I said, "You don't know that. She might have gone and eaten the mothballs out of the cupboard during the night."
Laura meant her mouth tasted like mothballs, not of mothballs. So that is an example of the kind of thing that an editor will look out for, and it's easily missed when you're writing. it doesn't actually make sense what you said. So then when we're happy with that, we're happy with structurally, we're happy with the line edit, we then send it to a different editor, the copy editor, who will also go through the manuscript with a fine-tooth comb, but from a more technical angle. And I think it's true to say that most writers do not really enjoy having their work copy edited. It can be quite a difficult process to go through a copy edit, and quite often the writer will just want to put things back in that the copy editor took out, because sometimes, occasionally, a copy editor is so focused on correctness, they kind of override the writer's style a little bit. So when we've had the manuscript back from a copy editor, there's quite a lot of further toing and froing and deciding which suggestions we're going to keep in and which ones we're going to take out. So there's a little bit of conversation around that. Oh, and then exhausted. And then eventually we're happy for the novel to go to the typesetter. It's typeset or laid out in the book form, and then that comes back and we do about 3, possibly 4 or more rounds of proofreading. And that's a very interesting process, because once it's been typeset, it looks completely different. The layout's different, and you spot all sorts of things that you don't spot in the Word document, such as repetitions, quite a lot of repetitions. And that's good fun. And then there's typos galore, so all sorts of things you just didn't notice in Word. So we do about 3 rounds of typesetting. And that can take anything from a month or 2 to 3 or 4 months or longer. That is why it's such a long lead-in time when you sign a book deal and the book actually comes out in 18 months. I try to go for 18 months, sometimes 2 years, because it can take a really long time. But I always say proofreading isn't really proofreading. I prefer to refer to it as proof looking, because if you slip into a quite lazy reading, you're going to miss all sorts of things, which is why I think all books have got at least one typo in, because it's so easy to miss things. So you're looking at each line, you're not really reading, if that makes sense. You do
pro proofreading after 3 books is read it backwards. So you start from the last page, you read it 1 paragraph at a time, going up. And that way you're not concerned with the story at all. You're just literally looking at the words, and that has helped me enormously. Although it did help me pick out a plot hole or consistency error in the first book, because I'd read something earlier that was later on in the book and someone referred to it earlier on and so on. And I just missed it. We'd all missed it for all those edits, and it was at the proofreading stage that I spotted it, and I'm glad I did.
Yeah, that's great.
It's definitely worth doing. It sounds mental and it feels really weird to start with.
But it's exactly the right thing to do if it works for you, because it stops you from just simply reading. It ensures you're looking, which it's not quite the same thing. And then eventually, once it's all been proofread and we're happy, we do 1 more read through, and then the book goes to the printer. And then there's no going back. That's done. So I've got some top tips. I want to talk to you about, and that's our process when we're publishing, but also I think it might be helpful for me to talk about editing, self-editing and editing before you have a book deal. So my number 1 top tip is defensiveness is the least helpful attitude when you're being edited. It's very tempting to get defensive. Nobody, your editor may suggest you take out a sentence that you're particularly proud of or fond of, and it can be very hard to let things go. But you do have to be open to killing your darlings, as the expression, and because sometimes the darling just isn't clear, or it just doesn't belong where you've got it. And the editors are very good at, I think we're very good at spotting when a sentence really isn't working. So being defensive is not helpful, but pick your arguments. And if your editor has suggested a deletion that you think is absolutely the wrong deletion, then go back to your editor and say, no, I don't agree with you. That's going to stay, and explain why, and then you can discuss it. I've never argued with any of my authors, but We've had some quite frank discussions. Okay, so an editor, my second tip, kind of cover that really, kill your darlings. An editor is really interested in clarity. Writers are not as good on clarity as editors are, is my opinion, because a writer has the disadvantage in a way of knowing what's going on in here. An editor and all the other readers don't know that we've only got what's on the page. So like I was saying earlier, an editor mediates between writer and reader, and I am slightly on the side of the reader, slightly more than I am the writer, although I'm keen to preserve a writer's style as well, so it's a real balancing act. But we don't know what's going on in your head. You do. So sometimes I'll put a note on Laura's manuscript and saying, is this making sense? And Laura will come back and explain to me why she's put it in there. And I say, yes, but is that on the page? That's what I'm getting at here. Is that I know what's going on in your head, but what's on the page? And that's really something that an editor focuses on, what's actually on the page. And my final tip before I shut up and let Laura speak some more is, in my opinion, the secret to good writing is to be unnoticed. That sounds a little counterproductive because we want to write beautiful sentences. What I mean by that is nothing jars, everything flows, it's clear, concise in some cases, and the author, the writer, the reader doesn't get jarred out of what they're reading. And sometimes writers will have a favourite sentence and they'll want to keep it, and that's the thing that's getting noticed and is jarring the reader out. So that's why sometimes an editor will suggest that you lose that particular sentence or paragraph or even a chapter, simply because it stands out, it's noticed, and it can just bump the reader out of the experience of reading the book, which you want to be immersive. You want them to forget that they're reading, ideally. And the best way for you to achieve that is to make your writing as unnoticeable as possible. And it's quite a hard thing to grasp, actually, but that's basically what we're after, a complete clarity of expression. And yeah, that's basically what I do. I'm there to keep you in line.
I just want to add to what you said about the defensiveness.
Yeah.
When Louise first signed me as an author, and I think she's done that for all her authors, she sends out this really helpful information pack that kind of explains how the editing process works and how you calculate royalties and how you make sense of royalty statements, and lots of really, really useful information that I'm very grateful that she sent me, because it made the whole process a lot clearer for me. And one of the things she said there about editing was that when you start the editing process, you leave your egos at the door. I think that really sums it up, because it is a dialogue, but it should be a frank dialogue, and it is a cooperation as much as it is, we're working together, even though she's saying get rid of that chapter, you don't need it. It is still, there's a point to it. And I used to really dread, before I got the structural edits for Fallible Justice, I was dreading it because I was convinced that she was going to make me rewrite the entire book and there wasn't a single sentence in it that was any good. And actually, when I got it back, I was like, oh, this is all right. And which is not to say there weren't lots and lots of corrections and changes, and we did an awful lot of work on it. But it wasn't, I was expecting to have to change my book to something unrecognizable, and I didn't have to.
Yeah.
And I would also say that actually, if you're not enjoying the editing process when you're working with someone, something is seriously wrong, because it should be an enjoyable cooperation. And if you're hating it or dreading it, there's a bigger problem than whether your comma is in the right place. Because I think working with Louise is awesome, and I'm not just saying that because in the novella manuscript I left her a comment that says that she's basically a mom telling two teenagers that abstinence is good for their soul. Well, we have great fun. I really enjoy it, and we have all these comments. And editing, the editor's role isn't always to say no, this has to go. Sometimes it's a comment like lol, or this is your new catchphrase, or this guy is hot, will he come back in your future books?
Also, coming back to what you said, I think before you've had a book deal and while you're still writing a novel, I have seen chat forums and things on Facebook groups and things where people are quite fearful of working with an editor. Oh, I don't need an editor. The editor is going to change everything. They're going to sap my style. They're going to edit the life out of my work. I think that rarely happens. A good editor doesn't do that. It's the opposite. I think a good editor helps to bring out qualities in the work that maybe you didn't even know were there. So I would say don't be fearful of working with an editor. I would go so far to say it's essential. We just can't see our own work. And I mean, I'm quite good at editing my own work, and I know you are too, Laura. I think professional writers tend to be. But you don't see everything, which is why an editor can help. I mean, you're right, it is fun. We do have fun, and nothing to be scared of. Embrace editing.
Absolutely brilliant. It sounds like a fruitful and like fun partnership for both of you. I'm just conscious that we have so many great questions already in the Q&A box. Are you both ready to maybe have some questions?
Yeah, sure.
Brilliant.
The only thing I'm going to say as a kind of, I didn't mention it earlier, is that when you work with beta readers, please say thank you. It really bugs me that when I do beta reading for someone, they don't say thank you. It just irritates me, because beta readers' job is not to tell you how wonderful you are. Their job is to say, this didn't work for me and this worked for me. And even if you get offended, you still say thank you, because they're helping you make your book better. That's my bugbear. And basically, you can consider a beta reader a precursor to working with an editor, because you should be getting the same kind of frankness and honesty from a beta reader. And if they said everything you've done is perfect and it's wonderful, then they've not done their job. Same with an editor. If editor thinks that, or says that there's no change needed and you're perfect, then it's not the right editor for you.
And so isn't that what we all secretly wish kind of people would say? It's perfect, you don't need to change anything, but that's not the most useful. It's not what we
often when I go to a beta reader, I've got either it's because I'm unsure, like I've just sent a middle grade children's book to a whole bunch of beta readers, because this is my first middle grade book and I need to know whether it works for the target audience, and they're all experts in that age category. Or it's that I might actually send a manuscript to a beta reader and go, I feel like something's not working, what do you think? And I have a specific, I may not iterate what my issue is when I send out a manuscript to someone else to look at, but I know there's something wrong with it. I don't know how to fix it. And someone else who reads it with a fresh pair of eyes often can say, this didn't work for me, and this is why. And I go, oh, that's how I fix it. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
We have a question from Francesca about paying a professional editor. So Francesca asks, is it advisable to pay for a professional edit of your manuscript before trying to find a literary agent? What do you both think about?
I think I answered that in the chat, in the question and answer box. I think if you can afford it, yes, because it will help you to send a much more polished manuscript to an agent. If it's unaffordable, then there are other options. You could have the first 3 chapters looked at. I do work for Jericho Writers, and they do a first 3 chapter critique, and that can be really, really helpful, because 3 chapters is often enough for you to be given the tools that you need to proceed and tweak the entire manuscript. So I would say if money is tight, aim for the first 3 chapters. But I think if you can get somebody to look at your work before you submit, it's really helpful. I had all my own novels critiqued before I've submitted them to my agent. It's really helped me.
And another question we got from Mona was asking about beta readers and finding what's a good way to find beta readers. Do either of you have any thoughts about particularly good places to find that? Or maybe you can talk a little bit about how you found your beta readers, Laura, who you like to work with.
Well, for this particular middle grade book that I've just sent out, I used my friends, which is generally not a great idea because they tend to be really kind in their comments, but these guys are brutal. They are properly brutal. And I use them specifically because one of them is a children's bookseller, and she's got all of them have got young children, so they're reading right on the age category, and they can ask their kids. In fact, I think one of them is making her kids read my book, which I feel slightly guilty about, but hopefully they'll like it. For my other books, I've used people I've met on Twitter. I don't tend to call out for beta reading and say randomly, would anyone like to beta read my manuscript? Because you don't really know who you're getting. So I tend to use people I trust and I know already. And I have people who have, from my first book, they keep volunteering, saying, if you ever need beta readers, I'll read your book. And I'm like, that's great, thank you, I'll bear you in mind. And I have sent, contacted them in the past and gone, you said you wanted to beta read my book. I've got a book, would you like to read it? And they're like, yay! So that's how I tend to find them. But I would say make friends with Twitter or any other community with like-minded writers writing in the same genre, and that is how you would probably the best way to go about it. And that's how I've tended to end up beta reading for other people. I do a little bit about it, although I'm brutal. I'm a horrible beta reader because I get really sarcastic and go, so your main character's arm is hurting, what about that first aid kit they just walked past? I'm not a nice person.
But sometimes that's the most helpful.
Well, he keeps sending me chocolate and alcohol, so I think he quite likes my beta reading.
So we have, just checking the chat here. So if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. We've still got a little bit of time here. I actually had a question about, because this seems like such a fruitful partnership between the two of you. So I was thinking kind of what qualities you might recommend someone looking for in an editor that they were working with. Like what qualities do you think would make that relationship function and thrive best? Anything that you'd recommend? And I also see we have some questions earlier in the chat, so I'll let you have an answer to that, and I'll have a look at some of our other.
I actually think trust is quite an important quality. The trust normally comes with somebody that you've already worked with, but just trust your instincts. And if you like somebody, maybe you interacted with them on Twitter, or you just feel that you might have an affinity with them and could work with them. And also I think a sense of humor is really, really important. I've had a good fun and laugh with all my authors, and it really helps. It can be a little bit stressful to be told that something's not working, and it can be really disappointing. So keep your sense of humor intact, and find an editor who's also got a sense of humor, and then it's a lot easier. So it makes everything easier.
And also, I mean, it's great to work with someone who's really passionate, not just about producing quality books, but also passionate about your writing. Because when I first met Louise, she'd offered me the book deal, and we met up for coffee to talk about it before I signed the contract. And already at that point, she had all these ideas, and she was like, awesome, this, and tell me about the series and what's going to happen to this character. She was really into all of it. Yeah. And now, even now, she keeps sending me these emails saying, don't you dare let these two get together, because it's just not okay. And I love that, because she's as invested in my characters and in my series as I am. And it just makes the whole process so much nicer.
That passion, just keep that energy and that spark alive. I'm sure to want to keep working on it, I bet. gonna happen next. We have a question from another Louise asking, do you tend to edit on paper or on screen? Thanks. So you touched on this a little bit, but yeah, any kind of particular preferences in terms of screen or physical paper?
If you can, I would do both.
Yeah.
Because you can see different things on screen as you do on paper.
Yeah, absolutely. When we do after the typesetting and we do the first proofread, we always do that on paper. I print it off and send it to the authors. You spot, it's just a different way of looking at it, and you can spot things more readily on paper, I think. But yeah, both. Mostly I work on screen, but the one I will definitely do on paper is the first proofread.
And what about kind of original notes when you're first starting a story? We have a question from Casey about, are Laura's original story notes on paper, by hand? When you're first kind of getting into that world and getting those ideas, where do you go first?
Well, I am very fond of A3 pieces of paper. So because I write series, and I knew right from when I was working on the first book that it was going to be series, I have to bear in mind the books that are going to come later, so I have to foreshadow everything like 6 books in advance, so I can be super sneaky, and I have to be really mindful of the character development. So what I have is I have an A3 piece of paper that has columns for each of the first 7 books, I think, and then segments for each character where I will summarize the personal development points in each book that happen, and then I make sure that I follow them through in the future books. So for instance, in the first book, the main character is assaulted. I don't want to go into any more than that so I don't spoil anything. But in the next book, she smells the matching cologne to what the assailant was wearing, and that triggers her. Because I don't want to be one of those people who something really bad happens to the main character in one book, in the next book it's forgotten. So I want to make sure that the kind of ripples from that are carried through. And even in the 5th book, there is a moment where she returns to the feeling of helplessness from the first book, because it's something that mirrors that experience. So it helps to have all of that written down, because I've been at this for 4 years now. 4 years, and I've got at least another hang on, I'm on book 5. I've got another 5 books planned, and Louise keeps making hints about novellas that slide in between, so now I have to think about those as well. So there's a lot of story to fit in. And I also, because I write crime novels, I have to be really careful with the details, like the mechanics of the crime. So I write it all on A3 sheets of paper, so I've got victims and the different clues and what you've got in different crime scenes and all of it, so that I can make sure that the mechanics work and there's no glaring plot holes where the butler definitely did it because he just walked in and killed someone. So yeah, that's what I do. Sometimes for some of the books I tend to even write a chapter by chapter outline, and the thing to bear in mind with outlines is that they're great, but they're not a Bible, because normally by the time I've finished writing the outline, I'm already getting my red pen out and making amendments because I've realized I've forgotten something, or something is in the wrong place and something doesn't make sense. So they are a movable piece, but because I write them out on paper, they're a bit difficult to move around. But yeah, very pro pieces of paper.
And many pieces of paper, it sounds like. We've got a question here from Rosalind going back to the editing. Oh, that's a great question. So she's asking about, I found it's a lot easier to critique other people's work face to face rather than in cruel print. Do the panelists agree? Like having maybe phone calls or meeting in person in non kind of COVID times or Zoom, or how does that work in terms of delivering that feedback and yeah,
I tend to, when I do beta reading and critiquing, I tend to write comments in the manuscript and then I summarize it in an email and saying this worked, this didn't, make it better. So I'm an introverted Finn, so if I can avoid human contact, I absolutely will.
Oh, that's funny. No, I've recently had a few editorial chats with writers, and I think it depends on your own personality, what you prefer. Some people prefer face-to-face, some people want it in writing so they can go back to it. So I generally do reports, written reports, and also when I'm critiquing, I'll put lots of track changes, comments on as well, and do lots of sample edits on the actual manuscript to illustrate my points. But yeah, it can be good to chat as well, because you can feel a bit cut off from people, especially at the moment. It's nice to have a Zoom chat with somebody and talk about their work. And I think it helps the writer to actually talk about the plots and stuff. It helps crystallize things in their minds. So it's all down to what, I mean, I can do anything, but I do either of those, any of the options, but it's up to the writer, I think, to decide what's going to work for them.
Personalized. We've got, let's do one more question and then we can wrap it up. I know that I'm sure you could just keep going, so many different avenues and elements to explore. So we've got a question from Sarah about how many beta readers would you suggest per book? I'm sure it's quite an individual thing. What about for yourself, Laura? What do you think in terms of how many people you like to have a look at that?
It depends on per book. For the middle grade book, I've got 4 adults and possibly 2 free child slavery victims. So 4, but it's because it's a new area for me. I generally tend to use about 1 or 2 at most, but it's partly because I'm writing a series. I'm very comfortable in my style and in my character development and all of that. So I feel like, perhaps a little bit arrogantly, that I don't need it as much as I would have done. And if I branch out to a different genre, I'll probably have more beta readers, just because I want to make sure that I'm doing that genre justice. But it's a personal preference. I know some people like to have tens and tens of them. I just don't. I don't know as many people, but also, yeah, it gets very complicated when you're waiting for feedback from it's like 20 or 30 people, and then trying to incorporate all their comments into some kind of coherent feedback form. So it's too much for me.
Yeah, I imagine that would be a lot, trying to input all these different opinions and ideas and thoughts, and synthesizing that would be a challenge for sure. Brilliant. Well, I just want to thank you both so much for all of this insight and really practical, really useful, really fascinating stuff. So thank you both so much for your time and for taking part in the festival, and thanks everyone for being here as well. So thank you to Laura and thank you to Louise.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
It's been brilliant.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.